evidence.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can. Great. How are you guys doing?
Just
Awesome.
fine. How are you?
I'm very well. So yeah, I want to talk about the evidence for the resurrection, particularly the evidence pertaining to the post-resurrection appearances experienced by the disciples after Jesus' death. First of all, let's just get a sense of how far along the road you would agree with me on.
Sure.
Would you agree that the apostles made claims after the resurrection or after Jesus' death that Jesus had appeared alive from the dead? Would you agree with that?
There are stories about apostles. Mm-hmm. That's about as far as I would go.
So you wouldn't concede that the apostles claimed Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them?
I'm not personally convinced that the apostles actually are real, so.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I mean, what would you say about the eyewitness testimony and the Apostle Paul, for example?
There are stories of testimonies and stories of this and that.
I mean, you made the claim that you're skeptical that the apostles really existed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious how you deal with the eyewitness testimony from the Apostle Paul, because obviously he met the apostles, or so he claims. That's eyewitness testimony, is it not?
Interesting. So that's kind of like you saying you don't believe that Peter Pan exists, but my goal is to figure out why you think that that Peter Pan used, pixie dust.
So what are the eyewitness sources concerning Peter Pan?
Wendy was an eyewitness, wasn't she?
Yeah, Wendy was.
And is there evidence that Wendy existed?
Not that I found.
Well, there's overwhelming evidence that Paul existed. I mean, you would agree
Okay, so
with
what's
right?
that evidence?
Well, we have Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, for example. He was an eyewitness to Paul. We have 13 letters of Paul in the New Testament. I mean,
Okay, we've got Paul. I believe that Paul existed, and I believe he wrote letters. There's a lot of fabrications in those letters. How do we get from letters and stories to supernatural events?
Okay, I'm just questioning because it was claimed just a few minutes ago that you're skeptical that the apostles existed.
Me personally, yes, and I'm willing to I'm willing to go with you and hypothetically and say if they did exist, then what? But I'm just not hard convinced that they weren't 50 people that people just heard about and wrote stories about. I don't know.
Okay, because we have multiple lines of eyewitness testimony concerning the apostles. So I mean, no serious reputable scholar would debate that. I mean,
It's my understanding that the earliest document was Mark, and it was written around 90, and so
actually we have sources. I mean, that's not even the liberal dating from Mark. I mean, the liberal. I mean, Bart Ehrman would probably date Mark in the 70s AD. I would personally date Mark in the 50s. But we have sources that predate Mark's Gospel. 1 Corinthians, for example, was written between 50 and 55 AD. And we have also...
And this is Paul's letters, is that right?
Okay.
Yeah. The Epistle of Paul. Some of them are very, very early. 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest epistle of Paul. And within Paul's letters, we actually have material preserved for us, which goes very, very early indeed. Most famously, of course, being the creedal tradition summarized in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 through 7.
So how do we know that Paul wasn't just pulling a fast one on the early Christians and getting free dinner everywhere he went?
Well, Paul was subject to intense persecution. We know that from numerous sources, both from Paul's own testimony and also from eyewitness testimony of others. For example,
So if somebody's persecuted, they're telling the truth? Is that? Well,
it suggests that they're at least sincere in what they're saying. That's what it suggests. That there's nothing obvious that he had to gain from making things up, and he had everything to lose. If you look at the laundry list of his sufferings related to us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it's a long list, and we also have testimony from Rome and that. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, do you think that because he had in this situation, because he had everything to gain and nothing to lose, that means that it's true?
He had everything to lose and nothing to gain. It doesn't mean that it's true, but it means that he was sincere. And so the question was he making things up?
Well, but was it true? That's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about necessarily what the story is until I can get past the idea that it's true. You know what I mean?
Right. So we have So we have three, when anyone makes a claim, right, we have three contending hypotheses. We have the hypothesis that they are correct, we have the hypothesis that they're honestly mistaken, and we have the hypothesis that they made it up, they lied, right?
Okay.
And so I'm arguing, so I would argue against the hypothesis that Paul made it up, and I would argue against the hypothesis that he was honestly mistaken. And so then that would be my argument. The point is, the reason I'm bringing up Paul here is because Paul provides us with some testimony that the apostles made claims concerning the resurrection, that the apostles had claimed Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them after his death. And that's in 1 Corinthians 15, where he writes to the Corinthian Christians. He's writing from Ephesus in the early to mid-50s.
So Paul was, promoting these ideas, and I don't know, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we agree that there were apostles, and there were these stories.
What's your favorite story?
My favorite story?
Sorry if that sounded really insensitive. I didn't mean it that way.
The most significant story is the resurrection in the gospel.
Okay, so that's the one you called about, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm willing to go with the idea, let's say the apostles all existed and say they all had eyewitness testimony and they all say that the resurrection happened and you have evidence for that. How do we find that evidence?
Right. So we have evidence that the apostles claimed this from, as I said, the epistles of Paul, also from the Gospels and Acts. Okay, so let's grant that for the purpose of argument and move forward.
Sure.
And I think the evidence that the apostles claim that is overwhelming. That is the scholarly consensus across the theological spectrum, that the apostles sincerely came to believe Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. Now, when we look at the claims concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection experiences reported by the Gospels, we see that they are multisensory or polymodal in character. That is to say, that they involve not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, etc. Moreover,
are you reading this somewhere?
No, I'm not. And moreover, according to Acts 1, it was reported, the resurrection experiences were reported to happen over 40 days. So it was not just one brief and confusing episode.
Okay, so
that's a lot of claims.
So we got a lot of stories, and a lot of half-baked evidence doesn't get you to the truth.
So,
the question is, okay.
So what is the definition of evidence to you?
Well, I would define evidence in Bayesian terms as evidence. E is evidence for your hypothesis, H if and only if the probability of E is greater given H than given non-H. So, in other words, if you, to take an illustration.
So what is the probability that a human can resurrect?
Let me finish defining, and then we can talk about that.
Okay.
So if you imagine a court scene, and you have the accused, and the forensic scientist presents the murder weapon, which has the accused fingerprints on the handle or something like that. That is evidence for the guilt hypothesis because it's more probable or more expected given the hypothesis of guilt over innocence. And so that's how I bring evidence.
So I'm familiar with Bayesian analysis, and you have to have initial probabilities for a lot of things if you're going to try to make an argument with that, and you are assuming that gods exist and these sorts of things, and I would give initial probabilities of those as zero because we have no evidence for gods.
Zero?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, having no evidence doesn't make the probability zero.
Oh, well, then you don't get to make up a number.
How do you get it higher than zero?
Tell me exactly how you'd make up a number of the probability of the existence of God in order to plug into your equation to arrive at, Jesus resurrected.
And so, wait, I need to clarify a misunderstanding on your part regarding prior probability, because to claim or assert that a prior probability is zero means that you have to demonstrate some logical inconsistency in the proposition.
Well,
we have no evidence for God, right? So that's what I would use.
If the prior probability of something is zero, there's no amount of evidence that can overcome that.
So
then how do we get it above zero?
What probability would you assign for universe creating pixies? Couldn't you construct an argument that involves those and
say it's
with some
possible?
non-zero probability come up with all sorts of crazy crap as a result?
Well, for one thing, I haven't seen any evidence for the existence of.
I haven't
Well,
seen
we
any
haven't
for a
even-
God.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere.
My intuition is the probability of the pixies.
But why are we talking about intuition when we're talking about you called up saying that you had evidence?
Yeah. So as I said, we have the apostolic testimony concerning the resurrection. If you
I mean, I could say
You've
that
got
my intuition
stories
says
and
that
a
it's not real.
half-baked Bayesian analysis argument. So
finish my point. So we have three contending hypotheses as to the origins of the apostles' belief that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. We have the hypothesis they were telling the truth, or they were honestly mistaken, or they made it up, right?
Or
they
that
didn't
it was a
exist.
fucking story.
Well, that would come under one of these two hypotheses.
No, or they didn't even exist.
Yeah, it could be a meme
be completely
that just
fabricated.
was popular.
I mean, the hypothesis that the apostles didn't exist is on the level of flat earthism among
Wait.
scholarship.
Yeah, but maybe
go ahead.
we could, there's this movie about Abraham Lincoln being a vampire slayer. Well, Abraham Lincoln existed, but that doesn't mean he killed vampires, right?
Right, but we don't have any eyewitnesses claiming that he was a vampire, do we?
Okay, so if I put
We don't have
something
any
out
idea.
there,
This is for any of these things in the Bible either. We've got stories.
Yes, we do. We have the gospel.
so we have evidence that people believed it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
have
so we don't have
prompted-
any evidence that it was actually true.
Right. So what's the best explanation of that? So
I have, if you look at, hundreds of years ago, we had evidence, and we had enough evidence to make people believe that the world was flat. And then we found out we were wrong because we found more evidence. We found better evidence to prove us wrong. So now, hold on, I'm not done. So now we're talking about something that we can't necessarily prove wrong because we don't have an Earth to test and experiment on and show you that it's actually round. So you're like, we're past the is the Earth round or flat argument in the concept of God. We're saying, how do we know that it's there? We can't see it. We can't touch it. We can't test it. Where is it?
Well, it's a forensic analysis because these are events which transpired in the past and we can't repeat them. So we have to look at the clues that have been.
So then why do you think it still
this
exists?
is week T, right?
Let's say it did exist 2,000 years ago and Jesus was resurrected and there was a God. How do we have any evidence that that God is still here?
Because
I don't know if he's making that claim.
Oh, okay.
Because we have. God by definition is eternal, and so if God is eternal, then obviously
we decided that gods are eternal.
Okay, so it's a kind of a special pleading thing.
Okay.
Well, no, it's definitional to God because God is a necessary being, a being which exists necessarily. But that's moving off the topic.
So would you agree that 2,000-year-old stories are kind of weak evidence?
No, well, it depends. It depends on the nature of those stories and those accounts. If it wasn't eyewitness testimony,
suppose suppose the story says that 80 billion people believe the story in the story. Does that make it more believable? Does it?
Well, you have to look at the particulars of the case. Let me just make this point about this trilemma point. We have the three contending hypotheses that they were correct. They made it up, or they were honestly mistaken. The fact that,
or there were lies about their assertions.
Okay, but we can demonstrate that's false by looking at the accounts in Paul's letters and also in the Gospels and Acts that demonstrate the Gospels and Acts.
So just because a story has some internal consistency doesn't mean it's true, right?
No, I never said that. But we have the creedal tradition that Paul passes on 1 Corinthians 15. Notice also that in 1 Corinthians 15, after Paul was done describing the appearances, he goes on to talk about his own experience with the resurrection. In verse 11, he says, whether then it was I or they, meaning the apostles he just mentioned, so we preached and so he believed. And so thus he assumes that the message he's now proclaiming concerning the resurrection was the same as that proclaimed previously to the Corinthians by the apostles, in particular Peter, James, and the 12.
Okay.
And with independent reasons.
I'm not buying any of this. I'm sorry.
we have independent reason to think that the Corinthians were familiar and acquainted with Peter's preaching, because he mentions that the divisions of factions in the midst of the Corinthians in 1
Okay,
Corinthians 1.
again, if a story is internally consistent, does it make it true?
No, but I've never said that at any point in this.
So then why are we still going on about the story?
Well, we're...
Okay, so we don't believe the story, and you're telling me it's internally consistent.
We're employing forensic statement analyses. We're looking at these old accounts which have grounded in eyewitness testimony or written by eyewitnesses, and determining, are these eyewitnesses credible? The fact that the resurrection reports...
They're stories of eyewitnesses.
So when you have an eyewitness, hold on. So when you have an eyewitness, you have a lot of things that you have to work around. You have to work around what that eyewitness is claiming to see. You have to work on whether or not that eyewitness is likely to lie. You have to work on whether that eyewitness is likely to be wrong, which, I mean, that's huge for any person that has ever existed. That's very likely that a person can be wrong. You have to look at so many things for each individual eyewitness and prove that each thing is reliable. And it's like you're saying that just because they're eyewitnesses that we know that it's true. And it's like, well, we have eyewitnesses for things today that we can write off as completely invalid and illogical.
No, it's not that we know it's true because it's eyewitnesses, although that's part of the evidence for it. But it's
then
not
what's
only
the
part
better evidence? Better than eyewitness? 2,000 years ago.
You're giving weak evidence for something that is miraculous, and you need to have strong evidence for something that's miraculous.
So Don could tell me right now, I just met Don before the show, and he could tell me that he has a Lexus outside. And I'd say, okay, cool. Do I believe him? Well, sure, why not? But he could say that his Lexus is not only blue, but it flies and it runs off of milk. And, you know, that's an outrageous claim, right? So what should I do to figure out whether or not that's true? Well, okay, there's going to be a lot that's going to have to prove to me that that's real.
Yeah, and everybody in the audience agrees.
Right? And so if everybody says, oh, you know what, Don really does drive a car that runs on milk and it flies and all this stuff. It's like, okay, now let's look and see, is this claim 2,000 years old? And how do we really know if Don owned a car that flew on milk and it was 2,000 years ago?
Okay, there's a few things in there to talk about.
Sure.
The first thing is that it's not so much that the eyewitness. Sorry, it's more the nature of the eyewitness testimony that's important here. So
right, they're stories, right?
Okay, let me finish. Studies have shown that.
So there are really no eyewitnesses because we can't interview any of those people, right? So don't even use that term because it's a lie.
What's a lie?
Eyewitness.
We don't know if they were actually eyewitnesses
that
we can talk to and interrogate about this event.
We can't verify that. So what can we verify?
We do have their statements.
So what can we verify?
We have something claimed to be their statements, right?
And we can authenticate it by forensic statement analysis. We can look at how they interlock with one another. We can look at how they're corroborated by external sources.
That's not good enough for me.
If a story is internally consistent, it doesn't make it true, right?
You raise the bar to the point that there's no amount of evidence that could ever persuade you.
Maybe.
You know, God could come and fix Christianity's evil history and wipe it all clean and make it better and do that today, and I would believe that there was a God. So no.
By the way, you mentioned the old Carl Sagan slogan, the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, giving the example you gave. I completely disagree with that. I think all claims require sufficient evidence. And what you don't need a single extraordinary piece of evidence to establish a claim. You can have that.
I do for this one.
Lots of weak pieces of evidence, which cumulatively.
No, for extraordinary claims, you need extraordinary evidence.
So you're making the claim that you can hook together a bunch of weak, half-baked things that may or may not be true. And arrive at the truth. And
then saying, if you don't accept this, then you'll never accept anything.
I mean, if you have a sequence of facts that are individually true, they can add up to something, right? That's how we infer the age of the universe, for example, and the age of the earth is we look at a lot of different evidence, but those are not half-baked things. Those are not stories.
They're verified.
They're verified.
Over and over and over again by different people in different ways. They're checked and double-checked because they're extraordinary claims, so we had to come up with extraordinary evidence. So what's your extraordinary evidence that Jesus not only existed, but he resurrected? He came back from the dead.
I'm sorry, but this is straightforward mathematics.
This is mathematics?
Because you multiply the relative strength, you multiply the evidence together, and so weak pieces of evidence, if you have enough of them, equates to strong evidence. Would you not agree with that?
Okay, you've made a lot of logical mistakes here. You've made a bunch of false dichotomies or false trichotomies where you haven't considered all the possibilities, right? You claim that the evidence for God is non-zero, which is basically a
probability of zero.
I'm sorry?
We were talking at that particular point about the prior probability of God, which you said was zero.
That's what we would use, right? Because we don't have evidence for God. It's the same prior probability you would use for unicorns, right? If you wanted to make a half-baked story about unicorns, your prior probability would be zero.
Yeah, you start off not thinking it.
No, it's not. The prior probability of unicorns existing is not zero. It's higher than zero.
Okay.
Might be close to it, but it's not zero.
So how many things can you dream up that have a non-zero probability?
Oh, lots of things.
Okay.
Square circles, married bachelors.
Right, right. And so by definition, so you're agreeing that whatever Bayesian analysis you're going to do is necessarily incomplete.
Why?
Because you're not considering all those things. It seems like you would need to make an infinite argument, factoring in unicorns and flying pixies and Marduk and
for example, have you read the chapter in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology by Tim and Lydia McGrew, which makes a Bayesian argument assigning a prior probability which is generously low and trying to calculate a posterior probability of the resurrection based upon reasonable estimates of the relevant Bayes factors in their analysis.
I would consider it something like mathematical masturbation. I haven't read it, but I can pretty much assume that it's a big pile of BS. Please tell you what. Why don't you write the show TV at atheistexperience.com. I will personally respond to your email. I would love for you to give me this particular evidence, and I'll take a look at it, and I will try to find some flaws in it and show you that it's